July 26, 2020, Lantana, Florida. It's early Sunday morning in this coastal community just south of Palm Beach.
Lantana's kind of like all the rest of the smaller towns along the East Coast in Palm Beach County. It's a sleepy beach town.
Despite being so close to a tourist hotspot and on the coastline, Lantana isn't a tourist destination. It's mostly for the locals.
It's a small community, probably about 12,000 residents, middle class, mostly hardworking people who live there.
However, despite its small size, Lantana is no stranger to crime.
Some parts of Lantana, the further east you go, is a little more sketchy, if you will.
It is an area that is pretty high with crime and drugs and just other economic challenges.
At a small, unassuming motel on the east side of town, one of the guests is returning to his room after having a smoke.
When he went outside a few minutes earlier, he noticed the door to another guest room was open, and he didn't think anything of it. But as he's coming back, the door is still open.
His curiosity got the best of him, and he looked inside.
Hey, is anyone in there?
At first, he could only sort of see her legs that were sort of protruding from the edge of the bed because her body was being blocked by the bed.
Miss!
He walks in a little bit further in the room. He sees a woman face down in a pool of blood.
Miss! Miss!
He tried to check to see if she was alive, so he did feel her neck and her arm for a pulse. He did not find a pulse.
He immediately dials 911.
Yeah, I think I just found a dead body.
Within minutes, Lantana investigators are on the scene.
Police are no stranger to this area, and even this motel. This is an area where a lot of crime takes place.
They found the young woman laying on the floor, face down. Her hands were found above her head. And usually when someone is in that position, it would appear that they're trying to protect themselves from something happening. So it could tell the story that this young lady probably knew what was going to happen to her.
It looks like we're dealing with a gunshot wound.
She was struck one time in the neck, a through and through wound, and that type of wound will cause somebody to bleed out immediately and die.
Because of the way she's positioned, police believe that she was most likely crouched behind the bed in fear when the shot went through the mattress and hit her.
But who is she?
They find a wallet on the bed. When they open the wallet, they find the ID. The ID belongs to 29-year-old Denicia Seward.
Wherever Denicia Seward went, joy seemed to follow.
She had a personality out of this world. My sister loved gymnastics, and she loves to dance.
If any time somebody in the room was mad or whatever, she would know how to just make the whole energy change. That happy-go-lucky person, always the one that just bring light to any dark place.
As one of 5 siblings, Denicia always cherished being surrounded by the people who loved her.
I've got a big family, but we always was together until we got grown.
We always had each other's back.
But there was no one Denicia cherished more than her 4 kids.
Denicia loved her children.
She was the best mom.
She was really loving and caring about me. She was a very good person. She was funny.
However, being a single mom came with its fair share of challenges, and Denicia soon found herself struggling to keep up.
She started struggling with drug addiction.
She became overwhelmed by the financial responsibilities of raising 4 kids, and she had to make the difficult decision to let them live with their fathers while she got her finances in order.
She loved her children, and she wanted her children She was really sad that she currently didn't have them, and I know that she wanted them back.
Determined to make ends meet, Denicia got a job as an exotic dancer.
She was down on her luck at this time, and she was living in a motel. She was trying to better her life and get back on her feet.
She was like, I gotta provide my family, and that's what she did. That's what she did, so I respect it.
Denicia also had a supportive boyfriend named Jason Miller that was with her every step of the way.
How'd it go tonight?
Honey, does this answer your question?
They met at the club. He's like a kind of dude that he deals with girls like that, but he fell in like it to my sister.
You are good at what you do, that's for sure.
Thank you.
Jason was known as a bit of a gentle giant.
He's a big guy, but he's a teddy bear.
And he treated Denicia and her family with the utmost respect.
When they first met, he came to me like, look, man, I'm gonna take care of him. I know what people may say about me. I'm like, bro, just don't put your hands on my sister. I'm like, I don't care what you do. She's small, she's this big. Compared to you, she just don't put your hands on my sister.
With Jason by her side, it seemed like only a matter of time before Denicia would turn her life around and get her kids back.
She loved them, they were inseparable.
But Denicia's dreams for a better future are shattered when she's discovered shot to death inside a seedy motel on Lantana's east side.
When the Lantana Police Department began the task of processing the scene, they found evidence throughout the room that there was obviously a party, there was alcohol, there were empty drink containers.
They also see what could look like some drug paraphernalia.
Detectives can't help but wonder, was Denicia's murder the result of a drug deal gone wrong?
"29-year-old Denicia Seward was a single mother of 4 who had recently fallen on hard times.
She loved all her kids and would do anything for them.
She always came around when I needed her.
She was really sad that she currently didn't have them, and she wanted them back.
She decided she would do whatever it took to make that happen. So she really started hustling and made great progress towards her goals.
And with her boyfriend, Jason Miller, by her side, things were looking up.
She loved them, they were inseparable. I can't lie, like that was the most happiest I've ever seen her.
But in the early morning hours of July 26th, Denicia has been found brutally murdered in a motel room in Lantana, Florida.
So now they have to figure out who did this to her. In the room, detectives see what could look like some drug paraphernalia.
Detectives can't help but wonder, was Denicia's murder the result of a drug deal gone wrong?
When detectives continue to examine the room, they locate 6 shell casings sprawled across the floor.
It's clear the shot that hit Denicia wasn't the only shot fired that night.
The shell casings match each other. They were all shot from the same firearm.
It was determined that the firearm that was used was a Glock 40, which is a powerful weapon used by the military and most police agencies.
It's stunning that no one reported hearing these gunshots after they went off. But unfortunately, the sound of gunshots is pretty typical in this area.
A lot of times, people just don't want to get involved.
Further complicating things, motel management isn't on site.
Still no answer.
There's not a manager or motel employee detectives can easily speak with to get surveillance footage or more information.
As Lantana police continue trying to get a hold of someone that works at the motel, detectives get whatever limited information they can out of the other motel guests.
Some guests admitted they heard arguing coming from Denicia's room.
I heard arguing around 2:30 a.m.
The guests say it sounded like a male voice.
People said they were arguing for 3 hours and screaming like crazy.
See what he looked like?
No.
Detectives believe that whoever Denicia was arguing with that night must be the person who killed her.
Meanwhile, news of Denicia's passing spreads throughout the community.
There were lots of people that were posting on social media what they thought was happening at the motel. So her family and friends started to show up at the motel.
I was one of the first ones called, and I even thought it was real. When I had pulled up on the scene, the police grabbed me and tried to restrain me and stuff, and I was fighting with them and stuff.
Dad, my sister's in here. Sorry for your loss. All right, just break it down a little bit, all right?
Once investigators are able to calm Brian down, they try to see if he has any information that could aid in the investigation.
Do you have any idea who could have done this?
No, I have no idea. I just got out of prison.
I had just came home from prison. I never seen her a day alive after I got out.
So no boyfriends or anything that we need to look into?
No.
Brian doesn't believe Denicia's boyfriend, Jason Miller, is capable of this.
Denicia's relationship with her boyfriend Jason wasn't perfect, but no one could imagine him harming her.
He was her heart, but they were just going through trying times right then. She would deal with other dudes just to try to make him feel some type of way.
If Denicia was with another man the night she was killed, are police dealing with the love triangle here?
In July of 2020, police in Lantana, Florida are investigating the mysterious shooting death of 29-year-old Denicia Seward, and her family is still reeling from the tragic news.
Numb. You're just numb. That's the only way I can explain it. I went numb.
Denicia's loved ones have no idea who would do something like this to her.
Denicia had been dating a man named Jason Miller at the time of her death, and their relationship had its ups and downs. But Denicia's brother insists Jason would never do anything to harm her.
He would never do nothing like this.
She would deal with other dudes just to try to make him feel some type of way, but he was her heart.
Upon learning Denicia may have been seeing other men in addition to Jason, detectives must consider a new possibility.
If Denicia was with another man the night she was killed, are police dealing with a love triangle here?
Then when's the last time you had contact with Jason?
3 days ago.
Jason actually called Denicia's brother looking for her 3 days earlier.
He had asked me, can I find her? But she had called me like in the midst of the couple hours and she was like, oh, don't tell him where I'm at.
Just then, the man himself arrives on the scene.
I heard what happened.
Jason seems just as devastated by Denicia's passing as her family members.
Do you have any idea who she could have been with last night?
She was with someone?
Detectives must explain to Jason what they've learned from the other motel guests, that Denicia was heard arguing with a male in her room the night before.
I don't know who she was with. She definitely wasn't with me.
Jason says he was working the night shift during that time.
We had a number and name to your employer so that we can call and clear you. This is typical procedural things, okay?
Sure.
Jason is very cooperative, and he seems like he wants to do whatever he can to help with the investigation.
Thanks, fellas. We're sorry for your loss. Thanks.
But as detectives prepare to head back to the station to continue their investigation, they're stopped by another witness.
Denicia's friend, Izzy, comes on the scene. She's extremely emotional because who would expect something like this to happen to their friend?
Is it true? Is Denicia gone?
Izzy tells investigators that she was actually with Denicia in her motel room last night.
Cheers, man.
So that night before Denicia's demise, you have Denicia, Izzy, and 2 other friends, and they are socializing in the room. They're doing what young people do. They're partying with each other.
One of the guys was our friend Jamie, and the other guy was someone I never met. I think his name was Andre.
Yo, D, give me another drink.
Can you get it yourself?
Izzy could suspect that there was some sort of tension between Andre and Denicia.
Sit still.
Girl, he just in a mood. Anyway, you want to refill?
Sure.
But what about the drug paraphernalia found in the room?
Izzy says they didn't do any drugs that night, but admits Denicia struggled with drug addiction.
After a few hours of drinking, we were getting tired. So I asked Jamie to drive me home. Hey.
What's going on?
Can you take me home?
Sure.
Sometime fairly late or into the early morning hours, they both left together.
The only person left in the room with Denicia was this guy that Izzy only knows as Andre.
Later that day, detectives finally get their hands on the surveillance footage from the motel, and it confirms Izzy's account.
Around 9:34 p.m., they can see Denicia and a man they believe to be Andre arriving at the motel.
A few minutes later, Jamie shows up, and then Izzy arrives pretty soon after that.
Just before 3 a.m., Izzy and Jamie leave together, just like she described to the investigators.
There's no more activity until 3:35 a.m. when detectives can see Andre leaving the motel.
When Andre leaves, the door to the motel room is left ajar.
And no one else enters the motel room until 7:30 a.m. the following morning, when the other motel guest discovers Denicia's body.
For detectives, this can only mean one thing.
This Andre guy is their killer.
Florida detectives investigating the murder of 29-year-old Denicia Seward have just gotten their first big break in the case after obtaining surveillance video from the motel where she was killed.
They can see a man they only know as Andre leave the room shortly before her body was found.
He then goes into a dark-colored sedan and drives off.
When detectives run the plates on the vehicle, it comes back to 28-year-old Andre Ramirez.
At this point, they're certain Andre is their killer.
But surprisingly, Andre's background is completely clean.
Mr. Ramirez did not have a prior criminal history.
So what led him to kill Denicia?
Police need to track down Andre Ramirez immediately. There are still so many questions in this case.
Unfortunately, though, tracking down Andre is no easy task.
He's not at any of his last known addresses, and his phone is going straight to voicemail.
So they put out a bolo.
Next, detectives try contacting those closest to Andre.
The police reach out to his father because they know that if you're on the run, you usually need somebody's help in order to help you financially, or just usually you keep in touch with your family.
The detectives point blank tell him that his son is potentially linked to a murder case.
While Andre's father is shocked by the news, he responds with complete cooperation.
However, his father had said that he didn't know where his son was, and he hadn't spoken with him since the homicide happened.
But he did tell investigators that if he heard from his son, he would call them ASAP.
With still no leads on Andre's whereabouts, detectives sit down with another friend of Denicia's, Jamie Baker.
Thanks for coming in to talk with us, Jamie.
Of course.
Jamie was also there the night Denicia was killed.
And he knows more about Denicia's relationship with Andre Ramirez than Izzy does.
We go way back.
He actually went to middle school with both of them, so they sort of grew up together.
Jamie says that Denicia and Andre had recently rekindled a friendship, but soon that friendship became something more.
They were kind of on and off again, and there was no indication that they were in any sort of committed or serious relationship with one another.
Denicia's true commitment was to Jason.
So Izzy mentioned that Andre seemed to be upset that night you all were hanging out. Do you have any idea what he was upset about?
Was he jealous of Jason?
Nah. I don't even think he knew about Jason.
He suggests one of the problems in the relationship might have been Andre's issues with Denicia's job as an exotic dancer.
He tells the detectives that Andre confided in him about his issues and concerns with Denicia. Andre started to get a little insecure because she was a very beautiful woman and because of her profession. So there was room for jealousy, there was room for mistrust.
But was that enough motive for murder?
To the detectives, it still feels like something is missing here.
Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Andre's father receives an unexpected call from his son.
Hello? Hey, Dad. Andre? Son, where are you? The police are looking for you.
He asked where Andre was, but Andre would not tell him where he was located.
Andre did acknowledge to his father that he felt that he had failed his family, he had failed himself. His father is asking him to turn himself in, but he's fleeing.
Listen, you've got to come back.
Okay.
I think this is just a big misunderstanding. I'm sorry I let you down, Dad.
I've got to go.
Hello?
Andre's father immediately informs police about the phone call.
To detectives, the phone call is a clear admission of guilt.
It doesn't sound like he has any plans of coming back and facing the consequences. He's now on the run.
But the number Andre called from gives detectives a clue to his current whereabouts.
Andre's father says he didn't recognize the number that Andre called him from. It wasn't his main cell phone number.
I think it was a 404 number in Georgia.
So police officers speculate that he had to have got a phone, such as a track phone or a burner phone, in Georgia.
Could Andre still be there now?
It's possible he's hiding out somewhere in Georgia, but it's also possible he had just picked up this burner phone when he was passing through Georgia to his next destination.
Seeing the great lengths Andre has gone to evade capture, Lantana detectives decide to call in federal support.
The local police department doesn't have the capability to track a fugitive. So when you have a fugitive and he's left the state, you contact the U.S. Marshal's office.
They have the resources and the technology to track even burner phones, especially once they know the phone number, which they were able to acquire from Andre's father.
Lantana investigators also turn to the public for help.
A Crime Stoppers tip line offers a reward up to $3,000 for any tips leading to an arrest.
During this time, Denicia's loved ones are starting to grow restless.
It was frustrating because we wanted justice. But, I mean, we can't do the job that the police can do, so really, we just had to just wait and pray that he got caught.
And on July 29th, U.S. Marshals finally make a breakthrough in the case.
They're able to trace Andre's burner phone from the location where he first purchased it near Georgia through 3 other states: Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana.
Now, the phone is pinging almost 1,500 miles away in Texas.
Investigators are able to continue following Andre through Texas, where he finally stops in the city of Laredo.
U.S. Marshals actually notified authorities in Laredo, letting them know that Andre's phone was pinging in the area.
But there's one big problem.
Laredo is a stone's throw from the border.
And surveillance footage confirms investigators' worst fears.
You can see Mr. Ramirez basically parking his car and heading in the direction of the border.
Andre has fled to Mexico.
By July 2020, investigators have zeroed in on Andre Ramirez as the prime suspect in the murder of 29-year-old Denicia Seward.
However, he's now on the run.
He was last spotted in Laredo, Texas.
Authorities in Laredo locate Andre's abandoned car, but there's no sign of their fugitive.
They did a processing of that car.
In the trunk, he's got a speed loader for a Glock 40 that matched the type of casings that were located and the projectiles located on the scene. But they didn't find the weapon.
And surveillance footage confirms investigators' worst fears.
You can see Mr. Ramirez basically parking his car and heading in the direction of the border and basically just walking across the border into Mexico.
So now it's safe to say that Andre has fled to Mexico.
However, U.S. authorities aren't giving up.
At this point, all hands are on deck. You have the U.S. Marshals, you have the Mexican police, and then you have the authorities in Laredo. They are working together to make sure that they are able to secure Andre.
But several more months pass with no signs of Andre. And Denicia's loved ones start losing hope they'll ever see justice served in her case.
Like, this dude, there's no way he should have went on the run that long. Like, come on, like, that's crazy. Like, I don't even understand that.
He took my sister. I wanted him to rot.
With pressure mounting, Lantana detectives press on and continue building their case.
In early August, Lantana police get a call from one of Andre's friends.
He believes Andre stole a gun from him, and that was a gun used to kill Denicia.
All right, can you walk me through from when the last time you saw it and all the way through?
We went out to like shooting. It was on a Friday.
He and Andre had gone target shooting 2 weeks or so before the murder.
After they were done at the shooting range, Andre asked to borrow his gun for a while.
Okay. What kind of gun was it?
It was a Glock 40-22.
And the gun was never returned.
You saw what's going on with him though, right?
Yeah, my homeboy had sent me an article and I was like, holy.
So after he realized that Miss Seward was killed, that Andre Ramirez was missing, and that he was nowhere to be found, this friend then contacted law enforcement because he was concerned that this gun, if it did show up, it would come back registered to him, and he didn't want to be on the hook for this homicide.
But unfortunately, Andre's friend has no idea where he is now.
He hadn't spoken to him since that day at the shooting range.
However, when detectives get their hands on the cell phone records from Andre's main device, they finally start to get more answers on the motive in this crime.
Like Jamie described, Denicia and Andre appear to have had a very on and off relationship.
Things really started to become sticky between them, and it kind of escalates into this tense relationship.
It didn't help the situation when the couple's romantic relationship evolved into a working relationship.
In addition to being an exotic dancer, Denicia started working as an escort with the help of Andre.
We're going to be making money like you've never seen before.
Detectives found ads outlining Denicia's services on several platforms paid for by Andre.
He would also pay for her motel rooms and food while she was escorting.
These escorts, I mean, in Florida, they make quite a bit of money. So he was making money off her. What he did is he took a percentage of what she was doing. He'd get a motel room, and she could make up to $500 to $1,000 a night, depending on what the client was paying.
But through the text messages, It appears that Denicia eventually became uncomfortable with this setup.
In the text messages, detectives are able to see the distress that Denicia was in because she was constantly telling Andre about the things that she did not like in their relationship.
How'd it go?
Fine.
Let me see.
She felt that she was being mistreated or maybe even used. It does seem that she had expectations of him to be her protector, that she believed that there was more to the relationship than perhaps him helping profit from her body, which, looks like what happened here.
Andre, I don't want to do this anymore.
What?
Andre still tried to maintain control through saying, different things to kind of appeal to her heartstrings.
Baby, let's think about this for a second. Don't you want your kids back?
Yeah, but...
Baby, we're so close. Just look at this cash.
This is what you often see in an abusive relationship. Not all abuse is physical. And this sounds like this was more so about dominance and control.
Got another guy coming the next few hours. Get yourself cleaned up, okay?
If Denicia refused to let Andre control her, is that what sent Andre over the edge?
Now more than ever, investigators are desperate to track down Andre Ramirez.
With Andre having fled to Mexico, there was a chance they'd never find him.
But on July 9th, 2021, nearly a year after Denicia was killed, Lantana detectives get the call they've been waiting for.
Lantana homicide.
Mexican authorities found Andre.
Andre has been detained and he is in custody.
"29-year-old Andre Ramirez, wanted for the murder of Denicia Seward, crossed the Mexican border in a bid to evade capture.
For nearly a year, Andre had been successful in his escape.
But on July 9th, 2021, Andre's escape comes to an end.
Lantana homicide.
After months of dedicated police work, the U.S. Marshals finally developed a lead on Andre's location and coordinated with Mexican authorities to apprehend him.
Andre has been detained and he is in custody.
After Andre is extradited back to Florida, Lantana detectives finally get to sit down with the man that's been consuming their investigation for the past year.
So nice to finally meet you. You've been a busy guy.
But if detectives were hoping to get a confession out of Andre, they're out of luck.
It's time for you to come clean and tell us what happened.
I have nothing to tell you. I want an attorney.
Immediately, he lawyers up.
Are you sure, Andre? This is your last chance to tell us your side.
I'm sure.
But even without a confession, investigators are able to formulate a theory as to what happened on the night of July 25th.
Based on the statements from Izzy and Jamie, it's clear that there was some tension between Andre and Denicia that night.
Hey, what's this deal?
Girl, he just in a mood.
Investigators believe that tension had been building between Andre and Denicia because she didn't want to keep escorting. She was ready to quit.
But Andre was making a lot of money off of her, and he wanted to keep making that money.
Just before 3 a.m., Izzy and Jamie went home, leaving Denicia and Andre alone in the motel room.
One can only speculate what may have gone down in the room once everyone left.
But one thing is clear. The couple got into an argument that ensued for hours.
Multiple motel guests reported hearing it.
I'm so sick and tired of you taking advantage of me.
Where do you think you'd be without me, huh?
At some point, Andre drew the .40 caliber handgun he'd stolen from his friend.
What are you doing? Put that away.
Once Denicia realized what was about to happen, she ducked behind the bed for cover.
But it was too late.
Andre sprayed the room with bullets, one of which went through the mattress and hit Denicia.
Oh my God.
After she was dead, he probably started to panic.
He left the motel and started planning his escape,
which eventually led him to Mexico.
He didn't just drive home, he just drove and drove and drove until he ended up driving all the way to Texas and then fleeing to Mexico. This was a man who knew he just did something wrong, knew he did something horrible, knew he took her life, and just wanted to get out of there as fast as he could.
Andre Ramirez is charged with second-degree murder.
Prosecutors decided to go with second-degree murder charges in this case because they couldn't prove the crime was premeditated.
We didn't have any evidence to suggest that this was an intentional act. It seemed like it was a heat of passion type of thing.
But in Florida, the maximum penalty for second-degree murder is still pretty strict.
The maximum sentence for second-degree murder is life.
And with the plethora of evidence against him, Andre sees the writing on the wall.
Ultimately, Mr. Ramirez decided to accept a plea in this case. He pled to second-degree murder and agreed to spend 20 years in the Department of Corrections.
So in this type of case here, he's got to do 85% of that time. So he's still young enough to come out around the age of 50.
For Denicia's loved ones, it's a shockingly lenient sentence.
I'm glad he's not able to hurt anyone else, but I always feel like how you take someone out, that's how you should go.
I didn't truly understand the meaning behind it, but, you know, I guess death is not for us to understand.
No matter how you look at this is a senseless tragedy, and it should have never happened, and she deserved better.
That was my mom, and I love her a lot, and I miss her.
I just miss her presence, her goofiness. That's my only sister, you know? You never get another sister back. We all wish she was here, but she still is in spirit.
Like, I love her that much. Like, a lot of people say, oh, why you bringing her back up? But this is what I like. I feel like she's right here. You feel me? I feel like she's right here.
I want people to know that she was a very loving, kind, smart young lady. And I hope that this is gonna touch other women. If you have any signs or see signs of abuse, get help. Call somebody. Tell somebody. And it may save a life. And that's what I hope that we can get by doing this for Denicia Seward.
Abuse is never okay. If you or someone you love is in an abusive relationship, there is help available. Call the Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800.
There are places where darkness feels different. Not because the night is darker there, but because the landscape seems to remember what happened after the sun went down. Along the southern shore of Long Island, New York, the Atlantic pushes against a narrow strip of land known for its beaches, summer houses, boardwalks, and endless stretches of sand. During the warmer months, Gilgo Beach can look almost peaceful. Families come for the ocean. Tourists walk along the shore. Cars travel along Ocean Parkway beneath an open sky. But when winter arrives, the same landscape becomes something else. The crowds disappear. The beach empties. The wind moves through the dunes. The road seems to stretch into nowhere. And somewhere beyond the headlights, hidden among the brush and marshes, a mystery was waiting to be uncovered. For years, the name Gilgo Beach became synonymous with one of the most disturbing unsolved investigations in modern American criminal history. Human remains were discovered in the area, one after another, forcing investigators to confront the possibility that a killer had been operating in the shadows for years. Families waited for answers. Investigators searched for patterns. Journalists demanded explanations. And the public wanted to know one thing. Who was responsible? But there was another question, quieter and far more uncomfortable. What happens when the people responsible for finding the truth become part of the story themselves? At the center of that question was a man named James Burke. Burke was not convicted of killing anyone at Gilgo Beach. There is no established evidence that he participated in the murders. He was not the secret killer hiding behind a police badge. But for a period of time, James Burke occupied one of the most powerful positions in Suffolk County law enforcement. He became Chief of Department of the Suffolk County Police Department in 2012, at a moment when the Gilgo Beach investigation was already drawing national attention. He was a man whose job was to lead police officers. A man whose authority could shape investigations. A man whose decisions could influence what information moved through the department and what information remained inside it. And years later, that same man would find himself on the other side of an investigation. Not investigating. Not commanding. Not questioning a suspect. Answering questions himself. The beginning of Burke's downfall did not come from Gilgo Beach. It began with a stolen vehicle. On December 14, 2012, Christopher Loeb was arrested at his mother's home in Smithtown, Long Island. Investigators believed he had been involved in thefts from numerous vehicles. One of those vehicles belonged to James Burke. Inside Burke's SUV had been items connected to the chief personally and professionally, including ammunition, a gun belt, clothing, cigars, and other belongings. The theft was embarrassing. But what happened afterward would become something much larger. Loeb was taken into police custody. He was handcuffed. He was restrained inside the station. And eventually, James Burke himself entered the interrogation area. What happened inside that room would later become the subject of a federal investigation. According to the federal case against Burke, the chief assaulted Loeb while the suspect was restrained. Burke later pleaded guilty to violating Loeb's civil rights and conspiring to obstruct the investigation into the assault. The man who had spent his career enforcing the law had crossed a line that law enforcement could not simply explain away. But that was only the beginning. Because the allegations did not stop with violence. The federal case revealed something even more disturbing. After the assault, Burke was accused of using his position to pressure other officers into concealing what had happened. That meant the story was no longer simply about one violent encounter inside a police station. It was about power. It was about loyalty. It was about what people were willing to do when the person they were supposed to obey was also the person they were afraid to challenge. And this is where James Burke's story intersects with Gilgo Beach. Not because he has been proven to be responsible for the murders. He has not. The connection is more complicated. Burke was leading the Suffolk County Police Department during a period when the Gilgo Beach investigation was under intense scrutiny. Questions had already emerged about the investigation, about cooperation between law enforcement agencies, and about how information was handled. The FBI had become involved in the broader investigation. Different investigators had different theories. Different agencies had different resources. And somewhere in the middle of that complicated landscape stood the Suffolk County Police Department. Burke stood at the top. Years later, after Burke's own criminal conduct became public, people naturally began looking backward. They began examining the decisions made during his time in command. They began asking whether the investigation could have been handled differently. Whether information could have been shared more effectively. Whether opportunities had been missed. Whether institutional rivalries had slowed progress. Whether a culture of silence inside the department had affected cases beyond the one involving Christopher Loeb. Those questions are legitimate. But they must be separated from speculation. A police chief behaving unlawfully in one case does not prove that he was involved in another crime. A department suffering from internal problems does not automatically mean every unsolved murder was mishandled. And suspicion is not evidence. That distinction matters because Gilgo Beach has attracted enormous speculation over the years. The mystery became so powerful that almost every unexplained detail seemed capable of producing another theory. But the most compelling story is not necessarily the one with the most shocking accusation. Sometimes the truth is more disturbing precisely because it requires no conspiracy. James Burke was a powerful police officer. He abused that power. He attempted to conceal his misconduct. He was investigated by federal authorities. He was prosecuted. And he ultimately pleaded guilty. That is not speculation. That happened. On November 2, 2016, Burke was sentenced to 46 months in federal prison, followed by supervised release. The career that had taken him to the highest level of the Suffolk County Police Department was over. But the questions surrounding Gilgo Beach did not disappear. The bodies remained part of the history of Long Island. The families still carried the weight of unanswered questions. And the investigation continued to evolve long after Burke left his office. There is something deeply unsettling about that timeline. Imagine the contrast. A police chief sitting behind a desk, surrounded by authority, uniforms, weapons, files, and the machinery of law enforcement. Outside his office, investigators are trying to solve a series of horrific crimes. Families are waiting for answers. The public is demanding justice. And yet, behind the closed doors of the same institution, another kind of crime is taking place. A suspect is restrained. A superior officer loses control. Other officers witness what happened. And afterward, according to the federal case, pressure is placed on those officers to keep silent. The contrast is almost impossible to ignore. The institution exists to uncover hidden acts. But inside that institution, someone is trying to hide one. That is the central tension of James Burke's story. It is not the story of a detective who secretly became a serial killer. It is the story of a law enforcement leader whose own misconduct forced investigators to turn their attention toward him. And once that happened, the questions surrounding his leadership became impossible to avoid. How does an institution respond when one of its most powerful people becomes the subject of an investigation? Who investigates the investigators? Who watches the people who are supposed to watch everyone else? And perhaps most importantly, what happens to public trust when the badge that once represented authority becomes evidence in a criminal case? For the families connected to Gilgo Beach, these questions were never academic. They were about real people. Real lives. Real losses. Behind every case number was a person who once had a voice, a home, friends, routines, hopes, fears, and people who loved them. The victims were never simply evidence scattered across a crime scene. They were daughters. They were sisters. They were mothers. They were human beings whose stories became intertwined with one of the darkest mysteries in Long Island. And while the investigation searched for a killer, another story was developing in parallel. A story about the people holding the evidence. The people controlling information. The people making decisions. And one police chief whose career would eventually collapse under the weight of his own actions. James Burke would go from commanding officers to answering questions from federal investigators. From wearing the uniform to wearing prison clothes. From being the man whose authority could end an interrogation to becoming the subject of one. And yet, the mystery of Jilgo Beach would remain larger than him. That distinction is essential. Because the real question is not whether James Burke was the killer. The evidence does not establish that. The real question is what his story reveals about power inside a police department, and why his downfall caused people to look again at an investigation that had already been surrounded by controversy. For years, Jilgo Beach seemed to represent a void. A place where people disappeared. A place where secrets could be buried. A place where answers seemed to vanish into the landscape. But eventually, the darkness began to give something back. Not all at once. Not cleanly. Not without mistakes. The truth came in fragments. A body. A piece of evidence. A name. A witness. A forgotten detail. A decision made years earlier. And sometimes, the person who once stood closest to the investigation became part of the mystery surrounding it. James Burke's story begins there. Not with a murder weapon. Not with a confession to the Jilgo Beach killings. But with a badge, a stolen SUV, a restrained suspect, and a police station where the balance between authority and abuse of authority disappeared. What happened inside that room would eventually send a police chief to federal prison. But outside that room, along the lonely roads of Long Island, another mystery was still waiting. And the deeper investigators looked into Jilgo Beach, the harder it became to separate the search for a killer from the institutions that had spent years searching for him. The ocean kept moving. The road remained open. The dunes stood where they had always stood. And somewhere in the history of those investigations was a question that refused to disappear. When the people searching for the truth can no longer be trusted completely, how do you know where the truth begins? That is where the story of James Burke truly starts. Long Island is a place of contradictions. It is close enough to New York City to feel connected to one of the largest and busiest metropolitan areas in the world, yet there are stretches of its coastline where the noise of the city seems to disappear completely. To the south, the Atlantic Ocean presses against a long, narrow barrier island. Behind the dunes, marshes and waterways create a maze of dark, isolated spaces. Roads cut through the landscape, sometimes running for miles with little more than sand, grass, and ocean on either side. One of those roads is Ocean Parkway. During summer, the road can feel almost ordinary. Cars carry beachgoers toward the coast. Families pack coolers into trunks. Children fall asleep in the back seat while parents search for parking. Sunlight reflects from the windshield, and the smell of salt water seems to promise nothing more dangerous than sunburn. But the same road changes when the season ends. The beach becomes almost empty. The parking lots lose their crowds. The businesses close or reduce their hours. The wind becomes sharper. And at night, the darkness can seem enormous. There are no apartment buildings stretching endlessly into the sky. No crowded sidewalks. No constant traffic. No rows of brightly lit storefronts. There are simply stretches of road disappearing into darkness. That isolation would become one of the most important elements in the Jilgo Beach story. Because a place that feels harmless during the day can become completely different after midnight. For someone traveling alone, the landscape offers few witnesses. For someone trying to hide something, it offers distance. And for investigators searching for human remains, it presents another problem entirely. The ground is not simply ground. It is dunes, brush, wetlands, marshes, sand, and vegetation that changes with the seasons. Something hidden beneath that landscape can remain invisible for months or years. This was the environment in which the Jilgo Beach mystery unfolded. But before the investigation became national news, Suffolk County had its own complicated identity. The county stretches across eastern Long Island and contains communities that range from densely populated suburban areas to quiet coastal neighborhoods and isolated stretches of land. Law enforcement in such a place faces an unusual challenge. A major metropolitan area is nearby, but the geography is different. The population is large, yet certain areas can become remarkably isolated. A missing person can disappear into a crowded community and still become almost impossible to locate. And someone who wants to avoid attention can take advantage of roads, parks, beaches, and wooded areas where few people travel at night. By the late 2000s and early 2010s, Suffolk County had become the center of a mystery that would eventually attract investigators from multiple agencies. The first discoveries did not immediately reveal the full scale of what was happening. There was no single dramatic moment when authorities suddenly understood that they were dealing with something extraordinary. Instead, the picture emerged piece by piece. That is often how the most disturbing investigations develop. One discovery appears to be an isolated tragedy. Then another detail refuses to fit. Then another. And eventually investigators realize that what they are looking at may not be a collection of unrelated events. It may be a pattern. The Gilgo Beach case began attracting attention after police searched the area for the remains of a missing woman. The search was focused on finding one person. Instead, investigators encountered something much larger. Human remains were discovered along Ocean Parkway. Then more were found. The landscape that had seemed empty suddenly became a crime scene. What had looked like an ordinary stretch of coastal road became the center of an expanding investigation. The discovery changed everything. Investigators had to reconsider what they believed they were looking for. They were no longer simply searching for one missing woman. They were confronting the possibility that multiple victims had been left in the same general area. The question became unavoidable. Why here? Why this particular stretch of Long Island? Was it coincidence? Was someone deliberately choosing the location? And if so, what did the location tell investigators about the person responsible? Those questions would take years to answer. At the time, however, the investigation was still developing. Police officers moved through the landscape looking for evidence. Search teams examined areas that ordinary people would have driven past without giving them a second glance. The smallest details suddenly mattered. A tire track. A disturbed patch of earth. A piece of clothing. A discarded object. A location where vegetation appeared different from its surroundings. The problem was that the landscape itself was constantly changing. Rain altered the ground. Wind moved sand. Plants grew. Seasons came and went. The ocean continued its relentless movement. Nature did not preserve a crime scene for investigators. It slowly erased it. That reality made every hour important. Every search mattered. Every decision mattered. And every mistake could matter for years. It was during this period that James Burke's career was moving toward its highest point. Burke had spent years inside the Suffolk County Police Department. He had learned the structure of the organization, the personalities of officers, the internal hierarchy, and the pressures that come with commanding a large police force. By 2012, he had reached the position of Chief of Department. The title carried enormous authority. He was no longer simply one investigator among many. He was the senior uniformed officer in the department. His decisions could influence priorities. His leadership could shape the atmosphere inside the organization. His relationship with prosecutors and other agencies could affect cooperation. And when a case became politically sensitive or attracted national attention, the person at the top inevitably became part of the story. That was the position Burke occupied while the Gilgo Beach investigation continued. From the outside, the public saw police officers, search teams, investigators, press conferences, and photographs of the coastline. But inside the department, the reality was more complicated. Investigations are rarely clean. Different detectives have different theories. Agencies compete for resources. Jurisdictions overlap. Information can become fragmented. A detective may know something another investigator has never seen. One agency may possess evidence that another agency desperately wants. And sometimes, personal relationships between officials can determine how easily information moves. These problems are not unique to Suffolk County. They are part of the human side of law enforcement. Police departments are institutions built from people. People have ambitions. People have rivalries. People make mistakes. People protect colleagues. And sometimes, people protect themselves. That reality becomes especially important when examining James Burke's later downfall. Because the federal investigation into Burke would reveal a disturbing relationship between authority and loyalty. The Christopher Lubb incident demonstrated how quickly a powerful officer could turn the machinery of law enforcement inward. Lubb had been arrested as a suspect. Burke was supposed to represent the institution. But according to the federal case, Burke became the aggressor. And afterward, other officers were pressured to help conceal what had happened. The implication was profound. If a police department could be used to protect one of its own officers from accountability, then what happened when the same institution was responsible for investigating a complicated murder case? Again, this does not prove that Burke interfered with Gilgo Beach murders or protected a killer. There is no established evidence that he did. But the later misconduct changed the way people viewed the institution he had led. The public began looking backward. Every unexplained decision seemed more interesting. Every disagreement between agencies attracted attention. Every allegation of poor cooperation raised another question. Was the problem simply incompetence? Was it bureaucracy? Was it personal rivalry? Or was there something deeper? The answers were not immediately available. And while investigators wrestled with those questions, families were living through a different kind of nightmare. A missing person does not disappear only from a police database. They disappear from a kitchen table, from a bedroom, from a family photograph, from a phone contact list. Someone notices the empty chair. Someone checks the door. Someone calls again and again. Someone keeps expecting the phone to ring. The longer the silence continues, the heavier it becomes. For the families connected to the Gilgo Beach victims, the investigation was never simply an intellectual puzzle. It was personal. Each discovery brought a terrible possibility. Could this be their loved one? Could the search finally be over? And if the remains were identified, would identification bring relief or destroy the last remaining hope? This is one of the cruelest contradictions in missing person investigations. Families want answers. But sometimes the answer is the thing they fear most. The landscape of Gilgo Beach became a place where those answers were waiting. Every discovery meant that one family's uncertainty might finally have a name attached to it. But it also meant confronting the possibility that someone they loved had suffered a violent death. The investigators walking through the dunes could see evidence. The families saw lives. Those two perspectives would coexist throughout the investigation. Meanwhile, the media began transforming Gilgo Beach into a symbol. Images of the coastline appeared on television. Reporters stood near Ocean Parkway. Maps displayed the locations of the discoveries. The words, Gilgo Beach, became associated with missing women, hidden remains, and an unknown killer. The case began to develop its own mythology. And mythology can be dangerous. Because once a case becomes famous, facts and theories begin traveling together. A confirmed piece of evidence can sit beside an unproven rumor. A documented mistake can become mixed with an exaggerated story. A legitimate question can slowly turn into an accusation. That would eventually happen around James Burke. His criminal conduct was real. His conviction was real. The questions surrounding his leadership were real. But the leap from those facts to the claim that he was involved in the Gilgo Beach murders was something else entirely. It belonged to speculation. The difference would remain crucial. Still, one fact could not be ignored. The man responsible for leading one of the region's most powerful police organizations would eventually become a convicted federal criminal himself. And that revelation would cast a long shadow backward. To understand why that shadow became so powerful, it was necessary to understand the place first. Gilgo Beach was not just a name on a map. It was a landscape of isolation. A road surrounded by darkness. A coastline where the ocean erased footprints. A place where someone could vanish from the world while thousands of people lived only a short distance away. And as the investigation expanded, that landscape began to reveal more than investigators had expected. The remains were not telling the entire story. They were fragments. Fragments that pointed toward victims. Fragments that hinted at a pattern. Fragments that forced police to look deeper. But every answer produced another question. And behind all of it stood the Suffolk County Police Department, the institution responsible for much of the investigation. At the top stood James Burke. He had reached the highest position available to a police officer in the county. He was supposed to represent order in a place where terrible disorder had taken root. But the story that followed would show how fragile that image could become. Because before Burke became a federal prisoner, before Christopher Loeb's name became part of his downfall, before investigators turned their attention toward the chief himself, there were victims whose stories had already been interrupted. And those stories would become the heart of the mystery. The beach had given investigators the first clues. Now they needed to discover who the dead were. Only then could they begin asking the question that had haunted Long Island for years. Who had put them there? And why had this quiet strip of coastline become a place where people could disappear without anyone seeing what happened? The answers were waiting beneath the surface. And the deeper investigators searched, the darker the story became. Before Gilgo Beach became a mystery, before it became a headline, before investigators drew lines across maps and journalists gathered outside police stations, there were people living ordinary lives. They had apartments. They had families. They had friends who knew their favorite songs. They had jobs, routines, arguments, plans, disappointments, and small hopes for the future. Some were mothers. Some were daughters. Some were sisters. Some were women whose lives had become complicated long before anyone knew their names. And that matters, because when a case remains unsolved for years, the victims can slowly disappear behind the mystery. Their photographs become evidence. Their names become case files. Their last known movements become timelines. Their possessions become clues. But none of them began as a clue. They began as people. That distinction is especially important in the story of Gilgo Beach. The investigation eventually became known for a group of human remains discovered along the southern coast of Long Island. The discoveries raised the possibility that several deaths could be connected, creating a mystery that would grow far beyond the search for a single missing person. But before investigators could understand the pattern, they first had to understand the individuals. Who were these women? Where had they come from? Who loved them? Who was waiting for them to come home? And what had happened during the final hours of their lives? For the families, those questions were not abstract. They were painful pieces of a life that had suddenly stopped making sense. Imagine receiving a telephone call telling you that a loved one has disappeared. At first, there is disbelief. Maybe she is staying somewhere else. Maybe her phone is broken. Maybe she simply needs time. Maybe she will walk through the door tomorrow morning and explain everything. People hold on to ordinary explanations because ordinary explanations are easier to survive. But then a day becomes 2. 2 becomes 3. The phone remains silent. Messages remain unanswered. And eventually, hope begins fighting with fear. For some of the families connected to the Gilgo Beach investigation, that uncertainty lasted for years. The disappearance of a person creates a strange kind of absence. There is no funeral. No final goodbye. No certainty. The family remains suspended between hope and grief. Every unknown vehicle becomes interesting. Every unidentified body becomes terrifying. Every telephone call could change everything. And when investigators eventually discover human remains, that suspended uncertainty can finally collapse. But the collapse does not necessarily bring peace. Sometimes it brings the truth families have been trying desperately not to imagine. The women associated with the Gilgo Beach investigation came from different circumstances and lived different lives. There was no single portrait that explained all of them. That fact is important because early public discussion sometimes reduced the victims to stereotypes. Their occupations. Their relationships. Their personal struggles. The choices they made. The places they visited. The people they trusted. But none of those details diminished their humanity. A person does not become less deserving of protection because their life was complicated. A person does not become less worthy of justice because they made decisions other people did not understand. And a missing woman does not deserve less urgency simply because investigators have difficulty reconstructing her final days. For the families, she was never a stereotype. She was a daughter who called home. A mother whose children knew her voice. A sister whose absence changed the shape of family gatherings. A friend whose messages remained saved inside an old phone. That is the human reality behind the case. And it is one of the reasons the investigation became so emotionally powerful. The victims were not simply discovered. They were recovered from a state of uncertainty. Their identities, once established, gave families something that had been missing for far too long. A name. A face. A confirmation. And sometimes, confirmation can be both devastating and merciful. For investigators, identification was the beginning of a new phase. For families, it could feel like the end of a nightmare that had no ending. But another nightmare was beginning. Because identifying a victim creates a new question. Who did this? And why? The answer would prove much harder to find. The location of the remains suggested that someone had deliberately placed them there or that the deaths were connected in some way. Investigators had to consider the possibility that a person capable of killing once might have killed again. That possibility changed the meaning of every missing person report in the region. Every disappearance could potentially become significant. Every unidentified person could become part of a larger pattern. And every surviving relative had to wonder whether their loved one's disappearance was connected to something much darker. The public, meanwhile, saw only fragments. A photograph. A name. A missing person poster. A police vehicle. A stretch of beach. But families saw the details that never appeared in headlines. They remembered birthdays. They remembered childhood habits. They remembered the way someone laughed. They remembered arguments that seemed meaningless until the person was gone. They remembered the last conversation. And sometimes the last conversation became a permanent wound. What did she say? Was anything unusual? Did she sound frightened? Did she mention where she was going? Did she promise to call later? Those questions can repeat endlessly inside a person's mind. There is no way to go back. No way to pause time. No way to ask the question again. The investigation into Gilgo Beach therefore developed on two parallel tracks. One was the official investigation. Evidence. Searches. Interviews. Forensics. Records. Timelines. The other was deeply personal. Families trying to reconstruct the final movements of people they loved. Friends remembering details that detectives might not initially know. Photographs being handed over. Telephone records examined. Personal belongings preserved. The smallest pieces of a life suddenly became important. A photograph that had once been private could become evidence. A telephone call that once meant nothing could become a crucial timestamp. A routine trip could become the final known movement of a missing person. The transformation was brutal. A normal life became a timeline. A person became a case. And the longer the investigation continued, the more difficult it became to maintain the boundary between public fascination and private grief. Gilgo Beach attracted enormous attention because the circumstances were horrifying and mysterious. People wanted theories. They wanted suspects. They wanted a face to place beside the word killer. But families wanted something different. They wanted their loved ones remembered accurately. They wanted investigators to keep searching. And they wanted the person responsible to be held accountable. That difference between public curiosity and private grief is one of the most important aspects of any true crime story. For an audience, the case may last an hour. For a family, it can last decades. For viewers, the investigation begins when the documentary starts. For a victim's relatives, it began the moment the phone stopped being answered. The victims of Gilgo Beach deserved more than to become symbols of a mystery. They deserved to remain individuals. Their deaths were not simply events that created an interesting police investigation. They were violent interruptions of human lives. And somewhere behind every photograph was a future that never happened. There were conversations they never had. Places they never visited. People they never met. Days that never arrived. That is what violence takes. Not only the moment of death, but every moment afterward. Every birthday that comes without them. Every holiday where someone notices the empty place. Every family photograph with one person missing. Every question that begins with the words, "What if?" Those consequences are invisible in police reports. But they are real. And while families lived with that absence, investigators had to work through an enormous problem. They did not know exactly how many deaths were connected. They did not immediately know whether one offender was responsible for everything. They did not know whether the same person had targeted every victim. They did not know whether the location itself was part of the killer's method or simply a place where bodies could remain hidden. They had pieces. But the pieces did not yet form a complete picture. The discovery of remains had transformed the investigation. Now the investigators needed to reconstruct the lives that had been interrupted. That meant going backward. Backward through phone calls. Backward through relationships. Backward through the last known movements. Backward through places where the victims had been seen. And eventually, backward toward the person who had crossed paths with them. This is where the victim stories became crucial. Because a killer can hide a body. A killer can hide a weapon. A killer can destroy physical evidence. But a victim has already lived a life. That life leaves traces. People remember. Phones record. Documents remain. Photographs survive. Financial transactions create timelines. And sometimes, a seemingly insignificant detail can survive long after the person who created it is gone. Investigators would need every one of those traces. But the process would be slow. The case had no simple beginning and no obvious ending. Instead, it became a maze. And the families were forced to walk through that maze alongside investigators, often without knowing where the next turn would lead. For them, the central question was never simply, who is the killer? It was also, why her? Why did someone choose her? What happened during those final moments? Did she know she was in danger? Did she have any chance to escape? And did the person responsible understand that behind the victim was an entire network of people who would spend years searching for answers? Those questions remain among the most painful parts of the Gilgo Beach story. Because a murder does not end when the victim dies. The consequences spread outward. They reach parents, children, siblings, friends, investigators, communities, and eventually, the institutions responsible for justice. That final circle would become particularly important in the story of James Burke. The police department was supposed to speak for the victims when they could no longer speak for themselves. Its investigators were supposed to preserve evidence, follow leads, challenge assumptions, and refuse to stop simply because a case was difficult. The badge represented that responsibility. But the Burke scandal would later force people to confront an uncomfortable reality. The people carrying that badge were human too. They could make mistakes. They could abuse authority. They could protect one another. And in the case of James Burke, one of those officers at the highest level would eventually admit to criminal wrongdoing. For the victims and their families, that reality added another layer of pain. They were already fighting against the silence left by death. Now the public conversation was also beginning to question the institution that was supposed to deliver answers. But before those questions could fully emerge, the investigation had to move deeper into the darkness. The bodies had been found. The victims had to be identified. Their stories had to be reconstructed. And somewhere inside those stories were clues about the person who had taken them. The beach had provided the first physical evidence. The victims would provide something more powerful. A trail. Not a straight line. Not an obvious path. But fragments of information leading away from the sand and back into the lives of the living. And eventually, those fragments would force investigators to confront a possibility more frightening than a single murder. They might not be looking for one crime. They might be looking for a killer who had learned how to make people disappear. The families had already lost their loved ones. Now the investigation had to find out why. And somewhere beyond the dunes, beyond the headlines, beyond the police files and theories, the answer was waiting for someone patient enough to follow the trail. The search began with a missing woman. That detail is easy to forget now because the story that followed became so much larger. By the time the public heard the name Gilgo Beach, the investigation had already transformed into something far more disturbing. Human remains had been discovered. Search teams had moved through the coastal landscape. Families had been forced to confront the possibility that their missing loved ones were dead. Detectives were beginning to wonder whether several disappearances were connected. But at the beginning, there was no grand theory. There was simply a person who had vanished. Her name was Shanann Gilbert. Shanann was 23 years old when she disappeared in May 2010. She was a young woman whose life had taken complicated turns, but whose disappearance would eventually become one of the central mysteries surrounding Gilgo Beach. On the night she disappeared, Shanann was in Oak Beach, a small community near the barrier islands of Long Island. It was late. The darkness had settled over the neighborhood. The roads were quiet. Houses stood behind fences and vegetation, separated from one another by narrow stretches of road and darkness. Shanann had arrived in the area for an appointment. What happened afterward would become the subject of years of investigation, disagreement, and speculation. At some point during the night, Shanann became frightened. She ran. That single detail would become one of the most haunting parts of the entire case. A young woman running through the darkness, trying to get away from something she believed was threatening her. She moved from one house toward another. She knocked on doors. She spoke with people. She tried to find somewhere safe. But whatever she feared that night was not immediately understood by the people around her. Eventually, she disappeared into the darkness. No one knew exactly where she had gone. No one could see what happened after she left. And for the people who knew her, the hours that followed must have seemed impossible. A phone call. An unanswered message. A sudden silence. Then the realization that something was wrong. Police were contacted. A search began. At first, investigators were searching for one missing person. They did not know that the search would eventually uncover something else. They did not know that the ground near Gilgo Beach was already holding secrets. They did not know that the investigation would eventually involve multiple victims. They did not know that years later, people would still be arguing about exactly what happened that night. They certainly did not know that the name James Burke would become connected to the broader story through the later failures and controversies surrounding the Suffolk County Police Department. The first stage of an investigation is often chaotic. Information arrives incomplete. Witnesses remember different details. People make assumptions. Evidence has to be located before it disappears. Investigators have to determine what is important and what is not. In a missing person case, the pressure is even greater. Every hour matters. A missing person might still be alive. They might be frightened. They might be injured. They might have been taken somewhere against their will. Or they might have chosen to disappear voluntarily. At the beginning, investigators do not know which possibility they are facing. That uncertainty can be agonizing for families. For Shanann's family, the uncertainty became unbearable. She had disappeared. Searchers began looking for her. The landscape around Oak Beach and the surrounding coastline was enormous. There were roads, marshes, waterways, dense vegetation, dunes, private properties, open stretches of land. Every possibility required attention. And then, during the search, investigators found something they were not expecting. Human remains. The discovery changed the case. A missing person investigation suddenly became something much larger. The remains were identified as belonging to another woman, not Shanann. And that created a terrifying possibility. If one body was hidden near the area where Shanann had disappeared, could there be more? Searchers returned to the landscape. They expanded the search. And the coast began giving up more secrets. One set of remains became another. Then another. The discoveries were not scattered randomly across the entire region. Several were found along a relatively concentrated stretch of Ocean Parkway near Gilgo Beach. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Investigators were no longer dealing with an isolated death. They were looking at a cluster. A cluster meant a connection. A connection meant a possible offender. And suddenly, the question changed. It was no longer simply, where is Shanann? It became, who has been leaving bodies here? That question would haunt investigators for years. The location itself became part of the investigation. Why would someone choose this place? What did the killer know about the area? Was the offender local? Did the person know the roads? Did they understand the patterns of traffic? Did they know when the area would be empty? Did they choose the location because it was isolated, because it was familiar, or simply because it offered a place where bodies could remain undiscovered? Every possibility revealed something about the offender. But every possibility also created another problem. The more investigators discovered, the harder it became to determine whether all the victims had been killed by the same person. Some remains appeared to belong to women whose disappearances were connected to sex work. Some victims had very different circumstances. Some deaths occurred years apart. The evidence did not immediately provide a single, clean explanation. There were similarities. There were differences. There were gaps. And those gaps became dangerous because investigators could easily force unrelated events into one theory. That is one of the greatest challenges in serial homicide investigations. Once investigators begin to believe they are looking at a pattern, every new piece of information can appear to confirm the theory. But patterns must be tested. They must survive evidence. They must survive contradiction. They must survive facts that do not fit. The Gilgo Beach investigation would become a long battle between those two forces. The desire to find a single explanation. And the reality that the truth may be more complicated. Meanwhile, the families of the victims were receiving news that would change their lives forever. A missing woman was no longer simply missing. She had become part of an investigation into multiple deaths. The grief was no longer suspended between hope and fear. It had become something permanent. For investigators, however, the discoveries meant work. They had to document the remains, establish identities, determine causes of death where possible, compare evidence, reconstruct timelines, search for connections, look at phone records, examine financial transactions, interview friends and relatives, study the victims' last known movements, and search the enormous digital and physical landscape that surrounded them. The investigation was growing. So was the pressure. The public wanted an arrest. Families wanted answers. News organizations wanted information. Politicians wanted reassurance. And detectives had to work inside a system that was already dealing with the complexity of multiple agencies. The Suffolk County Police Department was central to the investigation. And eventually, federal investigators became involved as well. That relationship would later become an important part of the story. Different agencies bring different resources. The FBI has federal investigative authority, forensic capabilities, databases, intelligence resources, and experience with complex cases. Local police know the geography. They know the communities. They know the people. They understand the history of the area. In theory, those strengths should complement each other. But institutions are not machines. They are made of people. People disagree. People compete. People become territorial. And when a case attracts enormous public attention, professional pride can become another source of tension. Those tensions would later be discussed in connection with James Burke's leadership. But at the time, investigators were focused on something more immediate. They had bodies. They needed names. They needed answers. And somewhere in the evidence might be the key to identifying the person responsible. As the investigation continued, one fact became increasingly disturbing. The victims had been placed in locations where they could remain hidden. The offender appeared to understand the landscape. The bodies had not simply been abandoned in a crowded neighborhood. They had been taken to a place where darkness and isolation could protect a secret. That suggested planning. It suggested confidence. And perhaps most disturbingly, it suggested that whoever was responsible believed they could get away with it. That belief is one of the defining psychological features of many serial offenders. They develop routines. They learn what works. They begin to believe that they understand the risks. The absence of immediate consequences becomes its own form of reinforcement. Each successful act strengthens the illusion of control. But every crime also leaves traces. A phone call. A vehicle. A witness. A camera. A transaction. A biological sample. A mistake. The offender may not know which trace will eventually become the thread that pulls the entire case apart. The Gilgo Beach investigation was still searching for that thread. And while the public waited for an arrest, another story was quietly developing inside the Suffolk County Police Department. James Burke was rising. His career was advancing. His authority was increasing. And in 2012, he reached the top. He became chief of department. The timing was remarkable. The investigation into Gilgo Beach had already become one of the most important criminal investigations in the region. The department needed leadership. The public needed confidence. Families needed answers. And Burke was now the senior uniformed officer in the organization. From that position, he was not simply another detective working on a case. He represented the institution. That distinction would matter later. Because when his own criminal conduct came to light, people began asking whether the culture inside the institution had allowed him to operate with too much power. The Christopher Lubb incident would provide the clearest example. On December 14, 2012, Lubb was arrested in connection with thefts from vehicles. One of those vehicles belonged to Burke. Inside had been Burke's personal and professional belongings. The stolen property had been recovered. Lubb was in custody. The situation should have been straightforward. A suspect had been arrested. Investigators would question him. Evidence would be processed. Charges would follow. Instead, according to the federal case, Burke entered the interrogation area and assaulted Lubb while he was restrained. The details were disturbing. A suspect unable to freely move. A police chief with enormous institutional authority. A room where the balance of power was completely unequal. And then, according to federal prosecutors, an effort to make the incident disappear. That moment would eventually become the event that destroyed Burke's career. But in the immediate aftermath, the public knew very little. The Gilgo Beach investigation continued. The department continued its work. Burke continued to lead. The public saw the badge. They saw the title. They saw the authority. They did not yet see what was happening behind closed doors. And that is what makes this period so important. Two stories were developing at the same time. One was the search for an unknown killer. The other was the hidden misconduct of a police chief. The two stories were not the same. They should never be falsely merged. But they existed within the same institution and the same period of time. One investigation was searching for someone who had hidden crimes along the coast. Another investigation would eventually search for evidence that a powerful police officer had hidden his own misconduct. The first involved victims who could no longer speak. The second involved a suspect whose rights had been violated. And both raised the same fundamental question. Who was willing to tell the truth when telling the truth carried a price? For years, the Gilgo Beach case would remain unresolved. The investigation would pass through different theories. Different suspects would attract attention. Different agencies would become involved. And public frustration would grow. But every investigation reaches a point where the evidence either begins to connect or collapses into uncertainty. Gilgo Beach seemed trapped in uncertainty. The beach had given investigators bodies. The bodies had given them names. The names had given them histories. But the killer remained beyond reach. And James Burke, the man who stood at the top of the local police hierarchy, remained publicly associated with the institution searching for answers. Then, years later, the federal investigation into Burke would reveal the other side of his story. The police chief was not simply an observer of the criminal justice system. He had become one of its subjects. The man who had commanded investigators was now being investigated. The man who had been responsible for enforcing the rules had broken them. And the institution he represented had to confront the consequences. But none of that answered the central mystery. Who killed the women whose remains were found along Gilgo Beach? The answer would not come from a confession by James Burke. It would not come from an accusation. It would come from evidence accumulated over years. And that evidence would eventually lead investigators toward a different man. A man whose name had remained outside the center of the story for far longer than anyone expected. But before that breakthrough could happen, investigators had to survive years of dead ends. They had to separate coincidence from connection, rumor from evidence, mistake from deliberate action. And while the public searched for a villain, the families waited for something much simpler. A name. A face. An answer. The road along Gilgo Beach remained quiet. The dunes continued to shift. The ocean continued to erase footprints. But beneath the surface of the investigation, the pieces were beginning to move. The mystery was not over. It was only entering its longest and most frustrating chapter. The first bodies changed the meaning of the landscape. Before the discoveries, the stretch of coastline near Gilgo Beach was simply a place people passed through. Ocean Parkway carried drivers toward the beaches. The dunes stood quietly beside the road. The marshes spread beyond them, shaped by wind, rain, tides, and seasons. After the discoveries, nothing looked ordinary anymore. Every patch of brush seemed capable of hiding something. Every abandoned stretch of land became a possible crime scene. Every missing person report seemed to carry a new weight. The search for Shanann Gilbert had opened a door that investigators had not expected to find. Behind it was a much larger mystery. The remains discovered along the barrier island forced police to expand their understanding of what they were dealing with. The evidence suggested that multiple victims had been left in the same general region, creating the possibility of a serial offender or, at the very least, a series of deaths connected by circumstances that investigators had yet to understand. The discovery of human remains is unlike anything most people ever experience. For a detective, there is procedure. The area must be secured. The location must be documented. The remains must be photographed. Every object nearby must be considered. Searchers must move carefully. Nothing can be touched casually. Nothing can be dismissed because it looks insignificant. But beneath those procedures is something far more difficult. A person has been found. Someone's life has ended violently. And now their remains are lying in a place where they were never supposed to be. The first investigators who entered the area could not yet see the full picture. They saw evidence. They saw terrain. They saw bones and objects and disturbed ground. But the larger meaning would only emerge later. The discoveries came in a landscape that seemed almost designed to conceal secrets. The barrier island was narrow. The road was long. The dunes created natural barriers. The vegetation could block visibility. At certain points, a person could stand only a short distance from the roadway and still feel completely separated from the world. At night, that separation became even more pronounced. The ocean was nearby. The wind moved across the sand. The darkness swallowed distance. A vehicle could stop along the road without attracting the attention that it might receive in a crowded neighborhood. That did not mean the area was completely isolated. It was not. Cars traveled through. People lived nearby. Visitors came to the beaches. But the landscape offered something a killer might need. Time. And time can be enough. A person does not need an invisible location. They only need a location where nobody is watching at the exact moment they need to act. That possibility became part of the investigators' thinking. If the remains had been placed there deliberately, the location might tell them something about the offender. Perhaps the killer knew the area. Perhaps the killer had traveled along Ocean Parkway before. Perhaps the offender understood how quiet the area could become after dark. Perhaps the choice had been made simply because the killer believed the bodies would not be found. Every possibility mattered. But the investigators had another problem. They needed to determine which remains belonged to which missing people. Identification was crucial. Without a name, investigators had a body but not a history. With a name, they could begin rebuilding the victim's final days. They could contact family members. They could examine records. They could look at phone calls. They could reconstruct movements. They could ask who the victim had met. And they could search for the final person known to have been with them. This is how a cold case begins to come alive. Not through dramatic revelations. Through paperwork. Through photographs. Through conversations. Through old telephone records. Through people remembering something they had forgotten for years. Investigators began assembling pieces of the victims' lives. Some had worked in the sex industry. Some had used online advertisements to find clients. Some had been reported missing. Some had lived complicated lives that made reconstructing their final movements more difficult. But none of those circumstances changed the fundamental reality. They were victims. They had been killed. Someone had taken their lives. And someone had placed their remains in a location where they might never have been found. That last detail was especially important. A killer who hides a body is making a decision. The decision may be practical. It may be emotional. It may be part of an attempt to control the investigation. But whatever the motivation, the act creates a second crime scene. The place where the victim died and the place where the body was discovered may not be the same. That means investigators are often searching for two locations. The final resting place. And the place where the violence actually occurred. At Gilgo Beach, the distance between those two places became one of the great mysteries. Where had the victims died? Where had they been killed? Where had they met their killer? How had their bodies been transported? Who had access to a vehicle? Who knew the roads? Who could disappear into the night without attracting attention? The questions multiplied. And every question demanded evidence. That evidence did not arrive quickly. The case was enormous. Investigators had to consider missing persons from different communities. Different timelines. Different lifestyles. Different relationships. They had to determine whether similarities were meaningful or accidental. They also had to confront the possibility that not every victim found in the area had been killed by the same offender. This distinction would remain important. The phrase, Gilgo Beach murders, eventually became a convenient description for a complex collection of cases, but convenience can hide uncertainty. Investigators had to ask whether they were looking at one killer, multiple killers, or several unrelated deaths whose remains happened to be found in the same region. That question affected everything. If one killer was responsible, then investigators needed to identify a common pattern. If multiple killers were involved, then the similarities could be misleading. The landscape provided no easy answer. It simply held the remains. The investigators had to do the rest. As the search expanded, the public became increasingly fascinated. Television crews arrived. Newspapers followed every development. The coastline became recognizable across America. Images of the dunes appeared beside stories about missing women. Maps showed where bodies had been found. The case became a symbol of an unresolved mystery. But public attention can become a double-edged sword. It creates pressure. It can generate tips. It can bring witnesses forward. But it can also create noise. People call police with theories. Strangers claim to know something. Internet rumors begin. Names are thrown into conversations without evidence. A suspect can become famous simply because someone online thinks their behavior looked suspicious. Investigators must separate all of that from facts. A real investigation cannot be built from intuition alone. It needs evidence that can survive scrutiny. And Gilgo Beach required an extraordinary amount of scrutiny. Because the stakes were enormous. The families wanted answers. The police department wanted a resolution. Federal investigators wanted clarity. The public wanted justice. And somewhere out there, if one person was responsible for the deaths, that person was watching the investigation unfold. That is one of the most psychologically unsettling aspects of an unsolved serial murder case. The killer may know more than the investigators. The killer may understand exactly what happened. While detectives are reconstructing events from fragments, the offender possesses the complete story. They know where they were. They know what they did. They know what they left behind. They know which details are true. They also know which details investigators are getting wrong. That imbalance can last for years. It can become a kind of invisible psychological contest. The investigators search. The offender waits. The public speculates. The offender remains silent. Every new discovery threatens that silence. Every new forensic technique creates another risk. Every witness who remembers something could become dangerous. And every mistake by the killer can survive for years before someone recognizes its importance. In the Gilgo Beach investigation, that process was painfully slow. Years passed. The victims' families aged. Detectives changed assignments. Leadership changed. Technology improved. The case files grew. And still, the central question remained. Who was responsible? During this period, James Burke stood at the top of the Suffolk County Police Department. His position gave him immense authority. He was expected to provide leadership during a case that had become one of the most difficult investigations in the county. But behind the scenes, tensions existed between law enforcement agencies. The relationship between the Suffolk County Police Department and federal investigators would later attract significant attention. The FBI had resources that could potentially assist with a complex serial murder investigation. Local detectives possessed knowledge of the area and the victims. Cooperation should have been an advantage. Instead, allegations emerged that cooperation had been limited. Burke's leadership style became part of the controversy. The exact impact of those decisions on the Gilgo Beach investigation remains a subject of debate. But the broader problem is easier to understand. When agencies do not communicate effectively, information can become trapped. A detective may have a clue that another team never sees. A federal analyst may identify a pattern that local investigators do not know about. A local officer may possess knowledge of a suspect that never reaches another agency. Investigations depend on information moving. When information stops moving, progress can stop with it. And when the investigation concerns multiple murders, lost time can become irreversible. The longer a case remains unsolved, the more difficult it becomes. Witnesses forget. People move. Phones are replaced. Records disappear. Buildings are demolished. Vehicles are sold. Relationships change. A person who knew something in 2010 may remember far less 10 years later. The physical world itself changes. That is why early investigative decisions matter so much. A mistake made on the first day can become impossible to correct 10 years later. The Gilgo Beach investigation would experience exactly that kind of time pressure. The remains had been discovered. The victims had been identified. But the killer remained free. Then came another layer of complexity. The search for Shanann Gilbert continued. Her disappearance had originally triggered the search that uncovered the other remains. Yet her case did not immediately fit neatly into the same pattern. Her death would become the subject of intense debate. Was she another victim? Was her death accidental? Was she killed? Was she connected to the other women? Investigators and experts would examine the evidence from different perspectives. The uncertainty created another division between what was known and what was believed. And that distinction would follow the case for years. Gilgo Beach became a story of unanswered questions. Some had evidence behind them. Others existed only because the evidence was incomplete. The challenge was knowing the difference. For investigators, the physical discoveries were the strongest starting point. Bodies cannot tell investigators everything. But they can reveal patterns. Location. Condition. Position. Objects nearby. Forensic evidence. Those details can establish timelines and eliminate theories. They can show how much an offender planned. They can reveal whether victims were restrained. They can suggest whether the same person may have been involved in different crimes. And sometimes, a single piece of forensic evidence can survive where human memory fails. That would eventually become crucial. Because the Gilgo Beach case was not going to be solved by rumor. It was going to be solved by evidence. But evidence takes time. And time was exactly what the investigation had too much of. Years passed while the killer remained unidentified. Meanwhile, the institution leading the investigation was itself beginning to fracture. James Burke's behavior toward Christopher Lubb would eventually become public. Federal investigators would uncover evidence of an assault and an effort to conceal it. Burke would be arrested. He would plead guilty. And in 2016, he would be sentenced to federal prison. That development changed the public perception of the Suffolk County Police Department. It did not prove that Burke had interfered with the Gilgo Beach murders. It did not make him a suspect in those killings. But it raised a disturbing institutional question. If the chief of police had been willing to abuse a restrained suspect and pressure officers to hide the misconduct, what did that say about the culture inside the department? The question was uncomfortable. It was also unavoidable. Because law enforcement depends on trust. People must believe that officers are telling the truth. That evidence is being handled properly. That suspects are treated according to the law. That investigators are willing to follow evidence even when it leads somewhere uncomfortable. When that trust breaks, every investigation becomes harder. Every decision is viewed through suspicion. And the victims suffer from that erosion of confidence. For the families connected to Gilgo Beach, none of this changed the central need. They wanted justice. They wanted someone held responsible. They wanted their loved ones remembered. And they wanted the investigation to keep moving. The beach had already given investigators the first major clues. Now the challenge was to turn those clues into a case. The remains had spoken. The victims' lives had provided fragments. The landscape had revealed a pattern. But the identity of the killer remained hidden. And somewhere inside thousands of pages of reports, millions of records, countless interviews, and years of unanswered questions, there was a thread. A thread so small that investigators could easily miss it. A thread connected to a person who believed the past had disappeared into the sand. But sand does not truly erase everything. Sometimes it only hides the evidence until someone knows where to look. And the next phase of the investigation would be a long search through suspects, theories, mistakes, and dead ends. The case was no longer simply about discovering bodies. It was about discovering the person who had placed them there. And that person had already made one crucial mistake. They had left something behind. For years, the Gilgo Beach investigation seemed to move in circles. Investigators had bodies. They had names. They had timelines. They had families waiting for answers. But they did not have the one thing everyone wanted. A killer. The case had become too large to ignore and too complicated to solve quickly. Every new lead seemed to open another door, and behind that door was another question. Who had met the victims? Who had contacted them? Who had driven them? Who had lied? Who had disappeared from the area after the killings? And who knew enough about the coastline to believe that a body could remain hidden there? The investigators were searching for a person who had been able to move through ordinary life while carrying an extraordinary secret. That meant looking at everyone. People connected to the victims. People who had contacted them online. People who lived near the coastline. People who owned vehicles. People whose names appeared in telephone records. People who had criminal histories. People who behaved strangely after the disappearances. And, inevitably, people whose names attracted attention simply because they seemed suspicious. But suspicion is not proof. That distinction became one of the most important problems in the investigation. The public wanted a face. Investigators needed evidence. The two things are not the same. One of the earliest major theories involved the possibility that the killer was targeting women who worked as escorts. Several of the victims had advertised their services online. They were meeting strangers. They were entering vehicles belonging to people they did not know well. From a criminal investigator's perspective, that created a potential vulnerability. The killer may have understood that these women sometimes met clients alone. He may have believed that if something happened to them, their disappearance would not immediately attract the same attention as that of someone with a predictable 9-to-5 life. That possibility was deeply disturbing. It also risked creating another dangerous assumption. That their work somehow made them responsible for the danger they faced. It did not. The killer was responsible. The victim's occupation did not excuse violence. But understanding the circumstances in which the victims met strangers could help investigators understand how the offender gained access to them. The investigation began looking backward through those meetings. Who had contacted them? What numbers had been used? Which online advertisements had been answered? Where were meetings arranged? Were there recurring patterns? Did one person appear under different names? Did certain telephone numbers repeat? Did certain locations appear again and again? Digital evidence was becoming increasingly important. A decade earlier, investigators might have relied heavily on paper records and witness statements. Now phones could preserve a detailed history of human movement. Calls could establish connections. Cell towers could help establish approximate locations. Online advertisements could preserve fragments of conversations. Electronic records could reveal relationships that people never mentioned voluntarily. But technology was not perfect. Old phones were lost. Accounts disappeared. Numbers changed. Records had limitations. And even when investigators found a connection, they still needed to determine what it meant. A telephone call between a suspect and a victim does not automatically mean murder. A meeting does not automatically mean guilt. A suspicious message does not establish responsibility. Investigators had to build a chain. And chains are only as strong as their weakest link. One name that became part of the broader speculation was Dr. Peter Hackett, a local physician associated with Oak Beach. Hackett became a controversial figure because of his interactions with Shanann Gilbert and because of statements he made regarding the night she disappeared. His name appeared in discussions surrounding the circumstances of Shanann's disappearance, and over time, theories developed around his possible involvement. But theories are not convictions. Hackett denied killing Shanann, and investigators did not establish that he was responsible for the murders discovered along Gilgo Beach. His story became another example of how difficult it was to separate genuine investigative questions from speculation. A person can appear strange. A person's story can contain contradictions. A person's behavior can look suspicious. None of those things alone proves murder. The investigation had to keep moving. And as investigators searched for a common offender, they encountered another problem. Not every body found in the area necessarily belonged to the same series of murders. The discoveries included victims whose circumstances differed. Some cases appeared strongly connected. Others remained uncertain. This created a classification problem. Which deaths belonged together? Which should be investigated separately? And could the decision to group cases together actually slow the investigation by forcing detectives to search for one killer when several offenders might have been involved? The question became especially important because Gilgo Beach had become a powerful label. Once the media began using the term to describe the investigation, every discovery became part of the same narrative. The public began thinking in terms of one killer, one hunting ground, one pattern. But the evidence was more complicated. The truth did not necessarily care about the narrative. Investigators had to. At the same time, the relationship between the Suffolk County Police Department and the FBI became increasingly significant. The FBI had become involved in the broader investigation. Its resources could be valuable in a case involving multiple victims and potentially interstate connections. But cooperation between agencies is never guaranteed. There can be disagreements over strategy, disagreements over authority, disagreements over information. And sometimes, personalities become as important as procedure. James Burke's leadership became controversial in this environment. Burke was known as a powerful figure inside Suffolk County law enforcement. He had spent years building his career. He understood the internal structure of the department. He knew who reported to whom. He knew which decisions belonged to which division. And he was now chief of department. That position could create enormous influence. It could also create fear. The later federal case involving Christopher Lubb would show just how badly that imbalance of power could be abused. But before that scandal became public, the department was dealing with the Gilgo Beach investigation. The FBI's role became a source of tension. There were allegations that cooperation had been restricted. There were complaints about the way information was shared. There were disagreements about how the investigation should proceed. These controversies became especially important after Burke's downfall because people began looking back at his leadership. But it is important to maintain a line between documented facts and retrospective speculation. There is no established evidence that Burke protected the Gilgo Beach killer. There is no proven connection between Burke and the murders. His criminal conviction involved the assault of Christopher Lubb and the obstruction of that federal investigation. That is the evidence. The Gilgo Beach connection is institutional and historical. Burke was in charge of the department during a crucial period. His conduct later damaged public confidence in that department. That is significant. But it is not the same as saying he was involved in the killings. The distinction matters because true crime has a dangerous temptation. When an investigation contains unanswered questions, people want to connect every suspicious figure. Sometimes those connections are correct. Sometimes they are not. The job of investigators is to determine which is which. For years, they could not. The case continued to produce dead ends. People were questioned. Backgrounds were examined. Records were reviewed. But no single suspect could be tied conclusively to the murders. The killer remained anonymous. That anonymity created a strange psychological problem. The offender was invisible, but not necessarily unknown. Someone had to know something. Someone may have seen a vehicle. Someone may have noticed a person behaving strangely. Someone may have heard a conversation. Someone may have remembered a detail that seemed meaningless at the time. But memories decay. People rationalize what they see. They tell themselves that something unusual is probably nothing. And sometimes they do not realize that a strange moment they witnessed is connected to a murder until years later. Investigators needed those memories. They needed people to come forward. They needed someone to say, "I remember that." But the passage of time made that increasingly difficult. The families felt the weight of every year. The public became frustrated. And the department itself changed. Officers retired. Commanders moved on. New detectives inherited old files. The case accumulated layers. One generation of investigators left behind questions for the next. This is how a cold case can become almost impossible to solve. Not because there are no clues. Because there are too many. Thousands of pieces can become buried under thousands more. A detective opening the case years later may have to understand an investigation that began before they joined the department. They must learn old theories. Understand old mistakes. Review old interviews. And determine which evidence remains reliable. The Gilgo Beach files became a world of their own. But outside that world, James Burke's career was beginning to unravel. The Christopher Lubb case would eventually expose the behavior that had taken place inside the police station. According to the federal case, Lubb had stolen property from Burke's vehicle. That property included items of personal and professional significance. After Lubb was arrested, Burke became involved directly. He was not simply supervising the case. He entered the interrogation area. Lubb was restrained. And Burke assaulted him. The incident should have ended with an internal investigation. Instead, prosecutors later alleged that Burke pressured officers to hide the truth. That pressure was crucial. An assault is one crime. A coordinated effort to conceal it creates another. And when the person involved is the police chief, the imbalance of power becomes enormous. Officers who might otherwise report misconduct now have to decide whether they are willing to challenge their superior. That is where institutional culture becomes visible. A healthy institution depends on people being able to say no. To report wrongdoing. To document misconduct. To refuse illegal orders. When those protections fail, the institution begins protecting itself rather than the public. The federal investigation eventually broke through that wall. FBI agents began examining what had happened. Evidence was collected. Witnesses were interviewed. The investigation moved outside the Suffolk County Police Department. That outside scrutiny would eventually lead to Burke's arrest in December 2015. By then, his career was effectively finished. He had spent years climbing toward the highest level of local law enforcement. Now federal agents were investigating him. The irony was impossible to miss. Burke had once been responsible for supervising investigations. Now he was the subject. He had once been able to enter a room and command attention. Now prosecutors were building a case against him. He had once represented the authority of the badge. Now that badge could not protect him. In February 2016, Burke pleaded guilty. The admission removed one layer of uncertainty. There was no need for speculation about whether the assault had occurred. Burke accepted responsibility for violating Loeb's civil rights and participating in an obstruction conspiracy. Months later, he was sentenced to 46 months in federal prison. The fall was complete. But the Gilgo Beach investigation remained unresolved. And that created a strange aftermath. The conviction did not answer the questions surrounding the murders. Instead, it created new ones about the institution that had been responsible for investigating them. Could the investigation have been handled differently? Could cooperation with federal authorities have been stronger? Could information have moved more efficiently? Were opportunities lost? Could some leads have been pursued sooner? There were no simple answers. Some questions could be investigated. Others would remain matters of debate. But the damage to public confidence was real. People no longer looked at the Suffolk County Police Department with the same certainty. The badge was no longer enough. The title was no longer enough. The institution had to prove itself. And while that process unfolded, investigators continued searching for the Gilgo Beach killer. The investigation eventually became one of the longest and most expensive homicide investigations in the region. Yet for all the work, the person responsible remained beyond reach. The killer had survived the early investigation. The killer had survived the media attention. The killer had survived changing police leadership. The killer had survived years of technological advances. That survival could create arrogance. A person who commits a crime and avoids arrest may begin to believe they are smarter than everyone searching for them. But there is a flaw in that belief. Time does not only help the criminal. Time also helps investigators. Technology improves. Databases become larger. Old evidence can be tested again. New forensic methods can extract information that was impossible to obtain years earlier. And sometimes, investigators return to an old piece of evidence with a new question. That is where cold cases often change. Not because a completely new clue suddenly appears, but because investigators finally understand the clue they already had. For the Gilgo Beach investigation, that moment was still ahead. The breakthrough would not come from a sensational confession. It would come from careful work. Digital evidence. Forensic analysis. Telephone records. And an old piece of information that had been sitting in the shadows for years. The killer had believed the past was buried. But investigators were learning something important. Buried is not the same as gone. And while James Burke's story was moving toward prison, the Gilgo Beach investigation was moving toward a breakthrough of its own. The two stories were connected by time, by institution, and by the enormous questions surrounding Suffolk County law enforcement. But they would ultimately lead in different directions. Burke would answer for his own crimes. The Gilgo Beach investigation would eventually find another man. A man who had spent years believing he could remain anonymous. A man whose name would eventually become one of the most important names in the entire investigation. The search was about to change. For years, investigators had been looking at the beach. Now they were going to follow the evidence away from it. And this time, the trail would lead toward a suspect who had been much closer to the victims than anyone realized. For more than a decade, the Gilgo Beach case seemed to resist every attempt to solve it. The victims had names. Their families had waited. The remains had been recovered. The coastline had been searched. Investigators had followed leads that went nowhere. Suspects had been questioned. Theories had risen and collapsed. And somewhere beyond the reach of investigators, the person responsible continued living an ordinary life. That is what makes a cold case so difficult to understand. The killer does not necessarily disappear. Sometimes the killer simply goes home. They buy groceries. They pay bills. They drive to work. They talk to neighbors. They celebrate birthdays. They grow older. The world continues around them while the families of the victims remain trapped in the moment everything changed. For years, that appeared to be the fate of Gilgo Beach. Then the investigation began to move. Not because someone suddenly walked into a police station and confessed. Not because a dramatic witness appeared on television. Not because a hidden diary was discovered. The breakthrough came through something far less dramatic. Evidence. Evidence that had existed for years. Evidence that investigators could now examine with better technology, better databases, and a renewed determination to look at the case from another angle. The first major change was institutional. The leadership of Suffolk County law enforcement had changed. James Burke was gone. His career had collapsed under the weight of the Christopher Lubb case. He had pleaded guilty to federal charges. He had gone to prison. And whatever influence he once possessed over the department was gone. A different investigative atmosphere began to develop. The Gilgo Beach investigation could be reassessed. Old files could be reopened. Old assumptions could be questioned. And evidence that had once seemed insufficient could be examined again. This is often the quiet beginning of a breakthrough. Someone opens a file that another detective closed years earlier. Someone notices a detail that had been overlooked. Someone asks a question that had not been asked before. And suddenly, an old piece of evidence becomes new. The investigation began focusing more intensely on the digital trail surrounding the victims. For investigators, the phones were potentially more valuable than memories. People forget. Phones record. A telephone number can connect people who claim never to have met. A call can place two people in contact. A text message can reveal a meeting. A cell tower can establish an approximate location. An online advertisement can preserve a fragment of a relationship that otherwise might have disappeared completely. The digital world leaves footprints. Sometimes those footprints survive longer than the people who created them. The investigators returned to that digital trail. They studied telephone records associated with the victims. They examined patterns. They compared numbers. They searched for connections. And slowly, a particular pattern began to emerge. One telephone number had appeared in connection with multiple victims. The number itself was not a confession. It was not a fingerprint. It did not announce the identity of a killer. But it was a thread. And investigators had learned that threads matter. A single connection can lead to another. A number can lead to a subscriber. A subscriber can lead to a person. A person can lead to a vehicle. A vehicle can lead to a location. And a location can lead to evidence. The challenge was proving that the person behind the number was actually responsible. Investigators could not arrest someone simply because a phone number appeared in the records. They needed more. They needed a way to connect the digital evidence to physical evidence. They needed the suspect's identity. They needed his movements. They needed his history. They needed to know whether the connection was coincidence or something far more serious. The trail eventually led investigators toward a man named Rex Heuermann. He was not an obvious monster. That is one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. He was a New York architect. He had lived for years in Massapequa Park. He worked. He owned property. He interacted with people. He appeared to live an ordinary suburban life. There was nothing about the image he presented that immediately suggested the person investigators had been searching for. That contrast would become central to the story. The idea of a serial killer often creates a particular image in the public imagination. Someone visibly violent. Someone isolated. Someone whose behavior immediately raises suspicion. But real offenders do not always look like monsters. Some learn how to blend into ordinary life. They build routines. They create respectable identities. They learn what people expect from them. And they use that normal appearance as a shield. Investigators now had a name. But a name was only the beginning. They began examining Huerman's background. His residence. His work. His vehicles. His family. His finances. His digital activity. His possible connections to the victims. The investigation became increasingly focused. The question was no longer simply whether someone had contacted the victims. The question was whether one man could be connected to multiple parts of the case. The more investigators looked, the more important the telephone records became. The records suggested connections between the victims and numbers associated with Huerman. But again, investigators needed physical evidence. They needed something that could stand in court. That meant surveillance. It meant patience. It meant waiting. A suspect does not have to know he is being watched. Investigators can follow quietly. They can document movements. They can observe behavior. They can wait for an opportunity to obtain evidence without alerting the person under investigation. And that is what happened. The investigation became a careful exercise in surveillance. The investigators were no longer searching blindly. They had a target. But they still did not know whether the target was the killer. The difference between those two ideas could determine whether the entire investigation succeeded or failed. Investigators needed to build the case slowly. They needed to avoid alerting Huerman. They needed to know where he went. They needed to know who he contacted. They needed to know what he threw away. And eventually, they needed biological evidence. That is where the investigation became much more precise. Investigators collected discarded items connected to Huerman. Among the evidence obtained was a pizza crust discarded by him. The item was sent for forensic testing. The investigators were looking for DNA. They wanted to compare biological material associated with Huerman with evidence recovered from the victims. The science was no longer theoretical. It was measurable. A DNA profile can be extraordinarily powerful. It does not tell investigators everything about a crime. But when a profile is sufficiently consistent with evidence from a victim or crime scene, it can transform an investigation. The investigators waited. For the families, years had already passed. For the suspect, life continued. For the investigators, every laboratory result carried enormous consequences. Then the evidence began to connect. The investigation developed additional forensic evidence linking Huerman to the victims. Investigators also examined material recovered from crime scenes and other locations. The case was no longer built on one clue. It was becoming a network. Telephone records. Digital evidence. Surveillance. Physical evidence. DNA. Historical information. Each piece strengthened the next. And slowly, the man who had lived behind the appearance of normality became the central suspect. But investigators still had to be careful. They were building a case that would eventually have to survive in court. That meant every piece of evidence needed documentation. Every search needed justification. Every sample needed a chain of custody. Every forensic conclusion needed to withstand scrutiny. There was no room for the kind of shortcuts that had become so controversial during earlier years of the investigation. The case had already been damaged by institutional mistrust. This time, the evidence had to speak for itself. And then came the moment that changed everything. On July 13, 2023, Rex Huerman was arrested. For the families, the news was almost impossible to process. For more than a decade, the Gilgo Beach killings had represented uncertainty. Now there was a face. A name. A man in custody. The image of Huerman leaving court under police escort spread across the country. The mystery that had seemed almost impossible to solve suddenly had a central suspect. But an arrest is not the same as a conviction. Investigators still had to prove their case. And prosecutors had to demonstrate that the evidence connected Huerman to the murders beyond a reasonable doubt. The allegations against him were severe. He was accused of killing women whose remains had been discovered along the Gilgo Beach area. The investigation did not end with the arrest. In many ways, it entered another phase. Searches began. Investigators examined Huerman's property. They looked through his residence. They searched his vehicles. They examined digital devices and records. They looked for additional evidence. The investigation was expanding again, but this time it had direction. The suspect was no longer an unknown figure somewhere beyond the investigation. He had a name. He had an address. He had a history. He had a life that investigators could examine. And as they searched, another unsettling question emerged. How long had this been happening? Was Huerman responsible only for the killings already attributed to him? Or could there be others? Cold cases have a cruel logic. Once investigators identify a suspect, they begin looking at everything around him. Every unexplained disappearance. Every unsolved murder. Every suspicious event. Every piece of evidence that had never found a home. But again, investigators had to avoid turning possibility into fact. A suspect can be responsible for one crime without being responsible for every unsolved crime in the region. The truth requires evidence. And the search continued. For the families of the victims, however, the arrest represented something they had not experienced in years. Movement. The case was alive again. Investigators were no longer saying, "We don't know who did this." They were saying, "We have identified a suspect." That distinction is enormous. It changes the emotional landscape. For years, the families had lived with an invisible enemy. Now there was a person whose name they could hear. A person whose face they could see. A person who would have to answer questions in court. But there was another emotional complication. The arrest could not restore the dead. It could not return the years lost. It could not erase the pain. It could not give children back their mothers. It could not give parents back their daughters. Justice, even when it arrives, is not a time machine. It cannot undo what happened. It can only establish responsibility. That is why the breakthrough was both powerful and painful. The families had waited for this moment. But they had also been forced to imagine it countless times. What would the person look like? What would happen when police finally caught him? Would he confess? Would he deny everything? Would the evidence be enough? Would the case actually reach a courtroom? Would there finally be a verdict? The questions continued. And as prosecutors prepared their case, the story of James Burke returned to the background. Burke was no longer in command. He was no longer shaping the department. His own criminal conduct had already been established. The Gilgo Beach investigation had moved beyond him. And that was perhaps the most important development of all. The case could now be judged primarily by evidence. Not by the reputation of one police chief. Not by institutional rivalries. Not by rumors. Not by theories. Evidence. That is what the families had needed from the beginning. And evidence was finally bringing the investigation somewhere. The breakthrough also revealed something important about the nature of cold cases. Time can bury evidence. But time can also preserve it. Telephone companies store records. Photographs remain. DNA can survive. Digital accounts leave traces. Objects can remain hidden in plain sight. Technology changes. Investigators learn. And eventually, a clue that once seemed meaningless can become the key to a case. The Gilgo Beach investigation had survived years of uncertainty because someone kept looking. That persistence mattered. Not every lead worked. Not every theory was correct. Not every investigator agreed. But the evidence accumulated. And eventually, the accumulated evidence pointed toward one man. Rex Heuermann. The man who had spent years moving through suburban Long Island was now at the center of a murder investigation that had captured international attention. His arrest did not immediately answer every question. But it shattered the illusion that the killer would remain forever anonymous. The beach had been silent. The investigation had been slow. The evidence had been scattered. But the pieces were finally coming together. And with Heuermann in custody, investigators could begin asking a new and terrifying question. What else might they find? Because if the evidence connected him to the victims already known, there was a possibility that his story extended beyond those names. The search of his home and property could reveal more. His digital records could reveal more. His financial history could reveal more. And the investigators who had spent years looking at the victims could finally turn their attention toward the man accused of taking their lives. The mystery had entered a new stage. The killer was no longer an invisible shadow on the horizon. He had become a defendant. And soon, the evidence collected over years would have to be placed before a court. The families would hear details they had waited years to hear. The prosecution would attempt to reconstruct the crimes. The defense would challenge the evidence. And the question that had haunted Long Island for more than a decade would finally move toward its most important test. Not on the beach. Not in a police station. But inside a courtroom. Because finding a suspect is only the beginning. The real test is proving what that suspect did. And for the victims whose lives had been reduced to unanswered questions for so many years, the next chapter would be about something they had been denied for far too long. Accountability.